You're a pastor for 10 years, so you would have a lot of Bible knowledge and theological knowledge, I would assume. How do you sort of reconcile your sexuality to those Bible verses that condemn homosexuality?
So for me, it's like, one, it's not as black and white. It's not black and white. It really isn't. You interviewed David Bennett, and that's how I even ever stumbled across you. And I read A War of Loves, and I think David Bennett is one of the most amazing human beings. And at the end of the day, he sits on a side that he sees it one very clear way, and I see it differently. But it doesn't mean that we aren't supposed to love one another. It doesn't mean that we aren't supposed to be in community with one another. It doesn't mean that we are not supposed to stop sharing and bringing the gospel to people. Like that doesn't make, and I think that's where I struggle in this, is like, it just for some people that I have been in community with for a long time within the church have not been able to be in community with me anymore because of my decisions. And that's sad to me, because that's not it. Like, we can talk about the verses that speak to homosexuality, and let's say that it is black and white and it is wrong. Well, also the way that you're treating me is not the way that Jesus speaks of love, or is not the way that Jesus speaks of the church, or like, I struggle with that. So let's say I'm living a very wrong life right now. Aren't we all living a very wrong life if we're living it post-fall? Like, none of us have it figured out. So why is this one thing for me within where my context is? It's the one thing that we pull out and say, this is so broken and this is so wrong. And the day that I sat across from my executive pastor to say, hey, I still want to be on staff, but I am in a relationship and I want to honor you all because I know where you stand bylaws and I know where you stand theologically. And so I'm trying to figure out, like, is there a way I can stay on staff? And to be met with no. My hurt in that moment was, I need you to be invited into the fact that, like, I am coming to you. I am sharing the honesty of my life with you. You don't require that of anybody else to say, hey, last night I looked at porn, and for them to come into your office the next day and to share that with you. And for you to, like, need to know that, and for then you to decide if they're on staff or not. Like, that's really confusing for me. That's hard. That's challenging.
It's confusing even the way we look at sin, because, yeah, you can say, like, having sex outside of wedlock, or watching porn, or stealing from a shop, swearing, I don't know, getting drunk, like all these sort of external sort of behaviors that are condemned by the church. Or I don't even see that as sin. I see sin as a condition of the heart and a nature that is opposed to God. And I feel Jesus can only reveal that to us. So whenever we get into this sort of external behavior, condemnation towards people, it's just odd to me, because it just sort of deters people from really wanting to know who Jesus is.
Yes.
Like,
I totally agree, because we're working against ourselves in that moment. I'm like, what you're trying to communicate is, honestly, it's stripping the richness of Jesus. It's stripping the richness of the gospel. Because, yeah, I could go on a whole thing of, like, what I believe or what I think in that, but it does. I think it really does. I think you're right. It takes away from who Jesus is.
And C.S. Lewis talks a lot about he talks about fleshy sins and spiritual sins. And he says spiritual sins will mess you up more than any of these quote unquote fleshy sins, whatever they are. Quite often you can have someone who's, having sex outside of marriage and drinking and doing drugs or whatever, and they're often could be closer to the truth of God than someone who's serving in the church, but they're just prideful and self-righteous, and it's sort of like they worship their own sense of moral attainment as opposed to the literal God himself. It's almost like it reminds me of what Jesus says to the Pharisees, or I don't even know where he preached this. He's like, I will show those who think they see that they are blind, and those who are blind that they can see. And I'm just really seeing this play out in our culture quite often. Religious people, or people that go to church, they have a religious spirit to them instead of a Christ-like spirit. And I don't know where to even start to begin to make change there.